11:02 in the morning. A wristwatch on a Japanese man's arm stops at that exact second. Cracked. The hands are frozen. The metal casing has been warped by a heat no earthly fire can produce. Years later, that watch still sits behind glass in a museum in Nagasaki, and its hands still point to the same moment. 11:02. Somewhere across the Pacific, 500,000 young American men were already being issued orders for an invasion that was never supposed to happen. This is the story of what stopped it, and the 9 accidents in 3 hours that decided who would live. 6 miles above the city, inside the cramped nose of a B-29 bomber, a 27-year-old bombardier named Kermit Beahan presses his eye to the rubber cup of a Norden bombsight. Stadium. He sees a running track. He whispers 2 words into the intercom. "I've got it." The restraining hooks release. 10,800 pounds of plutonium and high-explosive tumbles from the belly of the aircraft. Sky over southern Japan is about to be split open by a second sun. 3 days earlier, another city had already died. Hiroshima was gone, erased, turned to shadow and ash by a weapon the world had never seen. And yet, the Empire of Japan had not surrendered. It had not even flinched. This is the story of the bomb that should never have fallen on Nagasaki. This is the story of 9 decisions, 3 hours, and a 20-second gap in the clouds that decided the fate of 40,000 souls. This is the story of a fatal calculation. In the summer of 1945, the war in the Pacific had entered a phase of pure mathematics. Not tactics, not strategy, cold, brutal arithmetic. How many men would die to end this? How many cities would burn? How many months would the killing continue before somewhere said stop? The city of Hiroshima had died at 8:15 in the morning on the 6th of August. A uranium weapon called Little Boy had detonated roughly 1,900 feet above the Shima Surgical Clinic. 70,000 people were killed in the first minute. The 30,000 would die by the end of the year from burns, from wounds, from a strange invisible poison the doctors had no name for. In Tokyo, the survivors were called the Big Six, the Supreme Council for the direction of the war. 6 men, 1 decision, and they could not agree. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki was 77 years old, a retired admiral, a man who had survived an assassination attempt in 1936 when young officers stormed his home and pumped bullets into his body. Lived when he should have died, and now he was tired, wanted peace. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo was 62, a career diplomat who had opposed the war with America from the beginning. Accept the Potsdam Declaration, with one condition: keep the emperor. Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai was 65, a quiet man, a former prime minister who had been forced out of office in 1940 for opposing the alliance with Nazi Germany. He knew what the Americans could do. He wanted to end it. 3 voices for peace and 3 voices for war. War Minister Karechika Anami was 58. A general, a samurai in a modern uniform, he wanted 4 conditions: keep the emperor, no occupation of the home islands. Japan disarm itself, let Japan try its own war criminals. Conditions the Americans would never accept in 1,000 years. Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu stood with Anami. Navy Chief of Staff Somu Toyoda stood with Anami. 3 and 3, a perfect deadlock. And in the deep bunker beneath the Imperial Palace, the hardliners made a calculation of their own. The Americans, they said, could not possibly have built more than one of these devices. Bluff, a one-time terror weapon. A single flash of light meant to break Japanese will. They were wrong. But before the truth of that error would fall from the sky on the 9th of August, another hammer blow was already on its way. Hammer blow the Big Six did not see coming. A hammer blow from a direction they had refused to imagine. 9th March, past midnight on the 9th of August, a wall of steel crossed the border into Manchuria. Operation August Storm. 1,577,000 soldiers of the Soviet Red Army. Battle-hardened veterans of Stalingrad, Kursk and Berlin. 96,000 artillery pieces, 5,500 tanks, 3,700 aircraft, all of it commanded by Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky. all of it moving on 3 simultaneous fronts: the Trans-Baikal Front from the west, First Far Eastern Front from the east, the Second Far Eastern Front from the north. Joseph Stalin had made a promise at the Yalta Conference in February. 3 months after the fall of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan. Germany had surrendered on the 8th of May. 3 months later to the day, Stalin kept his promise. Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact of 1941, which was supposed to last until 1946, was torn up in a single Kremlin conversation. Japanese Kwantung Army, which had once been the pride of the empire, 700,000 strong, a hollow ghost of itself. Its best divisions had been stripped away and sent to die on Pacific Islands. What remained was a shell of conscripts, old rifles and paper defenses. Soviet armored spearheads sliced through them like a razor through silk. In Tokyo, the last hope of the peace faction died in an instant. Because that hope, quietly nurtured for months, had been this: Soviet Union might act as a neutral broker. Stalin might sit at a table and negotiate terms between Japan and the Americans. At dawn on the 9th of August, that fantasy was buried under the treads of Soviet tanks. Still 5 hours before Bockscar would even reach its target. To understand why the second bomb was already loaded, already fueled, already waiting on a coral runway on a tiny island in the Marianas, you have to understand what the Americans were trying to prevent. The plan was called Operation Downfall, 2 phases. 2 invasions. Operation Olympic in November of 1945, an amphibious landing on the southern Japanese island of Kyushu. Operation Coronet in March of 1946, a landing on the plains of Honshu to capture Tokyo itself. The projected American casualties were staggering: 100,000, perhaps 1 million killed and wounded. The War Department ordered 500,000 Purple Heart medals struck in anticipation of the slaughter. Years later, the American military is still awarding medals from that original batch. They survived Korea, they survived Vietnam, they survived Iraq and Afghanistan. The scale of the bloodbath the United States was trying to avoid. The Japanese were ready. Their plan was called Ketsugo, Operation Decisive. 14 divisions, 900,000 regular troops packed into Kyushu, exactly where the Americans intended to land. 88 million civilians mobilized into the volunteer fighting corps. Schoolgirls armed with sharpened bamboo spears. 10,000 aircraft stockpiled for coordinated kamikaze waves. Night-swide submarines. Suicide boats. Suicide divers with explosives strapped to their backs, waiting in the shallows to detonate against American landing craft. The Japanese strategy was not to win. They knew they could not win. Strategy was to make the cost of victory so unbearable that Washington would come to the negotiating table on Japanese terms. General Curtis LeMay, 49 years old, the commander of the 21st Bomber Command, already tried to break Japan with fire. Of the 9th of March, 334 B-29s dropped incendiary bombs on Tokyo. 100,000 civilians burned to death in a single night. 15 square miles of the city were reduced to ash. Japan did not surrender. 66 Japanese cities had been struck by conventional bombing, burned, erased, and Japan did not surrender. On a small coral island in the western Pacific, a different kind of weapon was already waiting. The island was called Tinian. It sat in the Mariana Chain, captured from the Japanese in the summer of 1944. States Navy Seabees had transformed it into the largest and busiest airfield on Earth. 4 parallel runways, each 8,500 feet long, carved from coral and volcanic rock. Hundreds of B-29 superfortresses arranged in neat rows, engines being warmed by ground crews who worked around the clock. The Pacific unit stationed at North Field was the 509th Composite Group. Its commander was Colonel Paul Tibbets, 30 years old. Tibbets had personally recruited the crews. He had personally trained them. 6th of August, he had personally flown the aircraft that dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. But he would not fly the second mission. That job would fall to a 25-year-old major named Charles Sweeney. commander of the 393rd Bombardment Squadron. Lost. Sweeney had flown the observation aircraft during the Hiroshima mission. He had seen the mushroom cloud rise. He had felt the shockwave rattle his B-29 at 30,000 feet. Now he would deliver the second blow, and the weapon he would deliver was nothing like the first. Little boy, the Hiroshima bomb had been brutally simple. A uranium-235 weapon of the gun-type design. Masses, a conventional explosive charge, smoothbore barrel. Fire one piece of uranium into another and the chain reaction begins. Scientists at Los Alamos were so confident in the design that they had never bothered to test it. Different. Fat Man was a nightmare. The Americans had almost run out of uranium-235. It was slow and expensive. But plutonium-239 could be manufactured in industrial quantities in the reactors at Hanford, Washington. Was that plutonium could not be used into gun-type design. It fissioned too eagerly. The two masses would begin to react before they fully joined, producing a fizzle instead of a nuclear yield. The only way to make plutonium detonate was to crush it. Fat Man was 10 feet 8 inches long, 60 inches wide. 10,800 pounds of steel casing wrapped around a spherical shell of high explosives. Position B and baratol, precisely shaped into 32 explosive lenses arranged like the panels of a soccer ball. Center, a solid sphere of delta-phase plutonium alloy weighing just 13.6 pounds. Size of a softball. The plan was to detonate all 32 lenses at exactly the same instant. If the timing was off by even a millionth of a second, the compression would be asymmetric. Its beams would squirt out sideways like toothpaste and the bomb would fail. The Trinity test in the New Mexico desert on the 16th of July had proven the concept worked. Same design would be used on a living city. It was overseen by J. Robert Oppenheimer, 41 years old, scientific director of Los Alamos. The entire program was commanded by Major General Leslie Groves, 48 years old, a man who had also built the Pentagon and who now controlled the largest and most secret industrial enterprise in human history. Everything was ready. The plutonium core had been flown to Tinian. High explosive assembly was waiting. A B-29 named Bockscar was being fueled on the tarmac. Only one question remained: where would it fall? The original target list had been drawn up by the Target Committee in May of 1945. Cities: Kyoto, Hiroshima, Yokohama, Kokura, Niigata. Each chosen for a specific reason, each large enough to demonstrate the weapon's full destructive power. Militarily significant enough to justify the strike. Kyoto was at the top of the list. It was the largest untouched city in Japan. Over 1 million residents. Home to the Mitsubishi Aircraft Engine Works and dozens of other military factories. Geography: a flat basin surrounded by mountains was considered ideal for maximizing the atomic blast. General Groves wanted Kyoto specifically because it was intact. He wanted a target that had not been damaged by conventional bombing, so that the raw power of the new weapon could be observed and photographed with scientific precision. And there was one man who refused to let that happen. Henry Stimson, Secretary of War, 77 years old. Statesman who had served under 6 presidents. He had been Secretary of State under Herbert Hoover. He had negotiated with the Japanese in the 1920s. What Kyoto meant. Kyoto was not just a city. It was the ancient capital of Japan. It had been the imperial seat for over 1,000 years. It contained more than 2,000 Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines. Gardens and palaces and works of art that could never be replaced. Contained a personal memory. In the 1920s, Henry Stimson had honeymooned in Kyoto with his wife Mabel. He remembered the temples, he remembered the gardens. He remembered the quiet dignity of a city that had survived 1,000 years of war and change. Going to erase it. Stimson went directly to General Groves and ordered Kyoto removed from the target list. Groves protested. Groves argued Groves put Kyoto back on the list. And Stim took it off again. This happened 3 times. Finally, on the 24th of July, Stimson took his case directly to President Harry Truman, Secretary of War. Kyoto was permanently removed. Order was final, and a replacement had to be found. Replacement was a city on the western coast of Kyushu, a port, an industrial center, a place with a population of 263,000 people. Its harbor had been active for 400 years. Ailu, it was home to the Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works, which had built the torpedoes used at Pearl Harbor. It was also home to the largest Christian community in Japan. Since 1549, when the Jesuit missionary Francis Xavier had first landed in southern Japan, Nagasaki had been the heart of Japanese Catholicism. The Urakami district in the northern part of the city contained the largest Catholic cathedral in East Asia. 12,000 baptized Christians lived and worshipped in the shadow of its twin bell towers. Their families had kept the faith through 4 centuries of persecution, hidden in secret during the Tokugawa era, emerging into the open only after the Meiji Restoration. None of the men in Washington knew this. None of the men on Tinian knew this either. They knew only that Kokura, an industrial city on Kyushu, was now the primary target. Nagasaki, added to the list only because Stimson had loved a city he honeymooned in half a century earlier, was the backup. He entered the crosshairs because of an old man's memory of a garden. And on the morning of the 9th of August, 29 named Bockscar sat on the coral runway of North Field, engines cold, Bombay closed, plutonium waiting. Crew was assembling. The weather over Japan was closing in. A typhoon was coming. General Groves in Washington wanted the mission flown immediately, before the storm shut down flight operations for a week. Pressure was absolute. But no one on that tarmac knew what was about to go wrong. No one knew that a fuel pump in the tail of Bockscar was already dying. Other aircraft would fail to arrive at the rendezvous point. Smoke from a burning steel mill would blanket the primary target. The naval commander would break from standing orders. A break in the clouds 20 seconds long would appear at the exact moment the bomb had to fall. Decisions, 3 hours, 40,000 lives, fatal calculation that history has never finished making. The 8th of August was hot and still on Tinian. Kind of tropical heat that settles into the bones and refuses to leave even after the sun has gone down. Crews worked under floodlights, their shadows long across the coral tarmac. Fuel trucks moved in slow choreography around the fat silver bulk of a B-29 Superfortress that most of the men on the island did not yet realize would become the most infamous aircraft in the world. Its name was Bockscar. It had been named after its usual commander, Captain Frederick Bock, but Captain Bock would not fly it on the 9th of August because of a simple problem of hardware. The scientific instruments used to measure the yield of an atomic explosion had been installed on another B-29 called the Great Artist Day. Those instruments had been carefully calibrated for the Hiroshima mission on the 6th of August. Altered, wired and integrated into the aircraft's electrical system. To transfer them from the Great Artistee to Bockscar would take 6 to 8 hours of skilled work. Most time. So the crews simply swapped aircraft. Captain Bock and his men would fly the Great Artiste on the second mission, carrying the measurement equipment as they had over Hiroshima. Major Charles Sweeney and his crew, who normally flew the Great Artiste, would take Bockscar. A man who had never flown a particular airplane in combat would now fly it into the most consequential mission of the war. Sweeney was 25 years old. Slim, dark-haired, with the calm certainty of a young officer who had been trained by the best pilots in the American military. Grown up in Massachusetts, he had joined the Army Air Corps before Pearl Harbor. He had been handpicked by Paul Tibbets himself for the 509th Composite Group, a unit so secret that even the other airmen on Tinian had no idea what it was for. Beside him, in the pre-mission briefing, sat the men who would ride with him into history. Frederick Ashworth, 33 years old. Navy, a weaponeer. His job was to arm the atomic bomb in mid-flight and to make the final decision about whether and where it would be dropped. Quiet, methodical, the kind of officer who spoke only when he had something worth saying. Lieutenant Charles Albury, co-pilot, steady hand, steady voice. Captain Kermit Beahan, bombardier, the man who would put his eye to the Norden bomb site when the moment came. That day, the 9th of August, was Beahan's 27th birthday. Sergeant John Kuharek, flight engineer, the man who would notice the first thing that went wrong. They gathered in the briefing hut just after midnight. The chaplain offered a prayer. Someone handed out sandwiches. Passed around thermos flasks of coffee. Mood was serious but not solemn. These men had flown dozens of missions over Japan. They had watched cities burn beneath their wings. They had lost friends to flak and to fighters, and to the merciless mechanical failures of a bomber pushed to the edge of its design limits. But this mission was different. Everyone in the room knew it. The target was Kokura, a major industrial city on the northern coast of Kyushu. Site of the Kokura arsenal, one of the largest munitions plants in the Japanese Empire. If Kokura was obscured by weather, the secondary target was Nagasaki, city further south. The rules were absolute. We dropped visually. The bombardier had to see the target through the Norden bomb site with his own eyes. Other bombing was forbidden. This order stood as binding operational doctrine from 21st Bomber Command. Nobody in that briefing hut questioned it. At 2 in the morning, the crews walked out to their aircraft. At 3:47 in the morning of the 9th of August 1945, Bockscar rolled down the coral runway of North Field. And that is when everything began to go wrong. Master Sergeant John Kuharek had noticed it during the final pre-flight checks. Fuel transfer pump in the tail of the aircraft. Dead. Completely inoperable. The pump was supposed to move 640 gallons of aviation fuel from a reserve tank in the bomb bay to the main engine feeds. Without that pump, the fuel in the reserve tank was useless. It could not be burned. It could not be dumped. It just sat there, adding 3,600 pounds of dead weight to an aircraft that was already dangerously overloaded. Sweeney had a choice to make. Standard procedure said abort. Standard procedure said no combat mission would launch with a critical fuel system malfunction. Standard procedure said unload the bomb. Take the aircraft off the flight line and let the ground crews fix the pump before flying. But standard procedure had never been applied to a mission like this. Sweeney got on the radio. He called Colonel Tibbets on Tinian. He explained the problem. Tibbets was quiet for a moment, and then Tibbets said the words that made the decision final. It's your call. Sweeney thought about the typhoon. He thought about the weather window closing over Japan. He thought about General Groves in Washington, who wanted the second bomb dropped immediately to maintain the psychological pressure on the Japanese High Command. He thought about the 400,000 men who would land on Kyushu in November if this bomb did not force a surrender. Gave the order to fly. Bockscar was overweight. Crippled, Bockscar carried the most complex weapon ever devised by human hands. To launch into the dark. The four Wright R3000 350 duplex Cyclone engines screamed at full power. Sweeney held the nose down as the aircraft accelerated, eating up the runway foot by foot, second by second. The end of the runway approached. The ocean cliffs beyond. Gripped his seat. Kuharek watched the airspeed indicator. Said nothing. Bockscar lifted off with less than 100 feet of coral remaining. The wheels tucked into the wells. The bomber banked north, and a mission that had already been compromised before it began climbed into the tropical night. Plan called for Bockscar to fly north alone for several hours, then rendezvous with 2 other B-29s over the tiny volcanic island of Yakushima, just off the southern coast of Kyushu. Assembled, the 3-plane formation would proceed to the target. Aircraft, the Great Artisti flown by Captain Bock, carried the blast measurement instruments. The Big Stink, flown by Major James Hopkins, carried photographic equipment to document the strike for scientific analysis and for history. But before Bockscar could reach the rendezvous point, another problem had to be solved. Fat Man had been loaded into the bomb bay unarmed. High explosive lenses were in place. The plutonium core was seated in its cavity. The firing circuits had not been connected. This was a deliberate safety precaution. Accidental detonation on takeoff would not only destroy the aircraft and its crew, destroy the airfield, it would destroy every other B-29 on Tinian, leave a crater visible from space. The bomb had to be armed in flight. That job belonged to Commander Frederick Ashworth, not to his assistant, Lieutenant Philip Barnes. Somewhere over the Pacific at 20,000 feet, Ashworth unbuckled his safety harness and crawled from the pressurized crew compartment into the unpressurized bomb bay. Temperature was below freezing. The wind roared through the metal spaces. The bomb bay was dimly lit by a single work lamp, and directly in front of him hung 10,800 pounds of implosion-type nuclear weapon. Iron. He held a flashlight between his teeth. He worked with a small toolkit clipped to his belt. Removed 3 green safety plugs from the arming panel. He replaced them with 3 red arming plugs. Each red plug closed a firing circuit. Each red plug brought the weapon one step closer to a live state. Static discharge in that freezing bomb bay on fumble. In moment of inattention, 9 and the B-29 would vanish in a flash of gamma radiation over the empty Pacific. Otworth completed the arming sequence without incident. He crawled back to the crew compartment. He closed the hatch. In. And then, somewhere over Iwo Jima, Lieutenant Barnes noticed something that made his blood run cold. A red warning light on the bomb monitoring console. Blinking. Steadily, insistently, Barnes froze. Blinking red light on the arming panel could mean only one thing. Firing circuits were counting down to detonation. Called Ashworth over. The 2 men bent over the console. They checked the wiring, they checked the arming plug, they checked the schematic diagrams, and after several long minutes of the kind of quiet terror that only men riding inside a live nuclear weapon can understand, Ashworth found the problem. A pair of switches had been installed backwards on the console. The blinking light did not indicate an imminent detonation. It indicated only that the internal timers were operating normally. The circuit was safe. The bomb was armed but not counting down. Reversed the switches. The light went off. Nothing to Sweeney about it. There was no point. The mission would continue. At 9:45 in the morning, Bockscar arrived over Yakushima at 30,000 feet. Tisti was already there, orbiting in a slow racetrack pattern, waiting. Stink was nowhere to be seen. The rendezvous plan was clear. All 3 aircraft would form up at 30,000 feet, then proceed together to Kokura. Radio silence had been ordered. The Americans could not risk broadcasting a message that Japanese direction-finding equipment might use to vector interceptors toward them. Sweeney could not call the big stink, he could only wait. Mission profile allowed for a rendezvous delay of 15 minutes. 15 minutes, protocol said proceed to the target. Sweeney did not proceed. He wanted the photographic documentation. He wanted the scientific record. He wanted the big stink in the formation. So he continued to orbit. 15 minutes became 20. 20 became 30. 30 became 40. 45 minutes of holding pattern over a tiny volcanic island at 30,000 feet, burning aviation fuel at 400 gallons per hour. 640 gallons of dead weight in the bomb bay. Crippled aircraft, a shrinking margin. The big stink never came. What Sweeney did not know, what he could not know because of the enforced radio silence, was that Major Hopkins had misread his orders. Hopkins had climbed to 39,000 feet instead of 30,000. 9,000 feet above the rendezvous point, invisible to the 2 B-29s below him, searching for a formation that was searching for him. At 10:30 in the morning, Sweeney and Ashworth made the call. They would proceed with 2 aircraft. They would leave the big stink behind. And they would go to Kokura with less fuel than the mission plan required. Bockscar and the great Artisti turned north. Kokura came into view at 9:44 in the morning. The city sat on the northern coast of Kyushu, on the shore of the Kanman Strait. Arsenal was a sprawling industrial complex covering hundreds of acres. Vehicle plants, weapons factories, ammunition dumps. NATO, the kind of concentrated military industrial target that strategic bombing doctrine had been designed to erase. The weather forecast that morning had predicted clear skies over Kokura. The weather forecast had been wrong. The night before, on the 8th of August, 224 B-29 bombers from the 21st Bomber Command had firebombed the neighboring city of Yamata. Yamata was known as the Pittsburgh of Japan. It was the center of Japanese steel production. Its enormous steel works had burned through the night, and the fires were still burning at 9:44 in the morning on the 9th of August. Prevailing winds had shifted overnight, and they had pushed a massive curtain of black smoke and haze from the Yamata steel fires directly over Kokura. Pressed his eye to the Norden bombsight. He saw smoke, haze. He saw the general outline of the city below. But he could not see the aiming point. He could not see the arsenal complex. He could not see the specific ground reference points that the target folders had trained him to identify. Drop the bomb. Sweeney banked Bockscar into a long, slow turn. He would try again. The second bomb run was the same as the first. Searched. Beahan strained. Beahan could not see the target. The third bomb run, Japanese air defenses had woken up. Heavy anti-aircraft fire began to blossom around Bockscar. Type 10 120mm guns. Their bursts crept closer to the bomber's altitude with each salvo. A radio operator, monitoring Japanese frequencies, reported that fighters believed to be Nakajima Ki-45 Toryu twin-engine interceptors were scrambling from nearby airfields. Toryu was a heavy fighter, purpose-built for attacking American bombers. Carried 37mm cannons in its nose. Single hit from one of those cannons could tear through the aluminum skin of a B-29 like tissue paper. For nearly 50 minutes, Bockscar circled the primary target. 3 attempts, 3 failures. Fuel burning, anti-craft fire tightening. Closing. Moment, and in that moment, 3 men in a crippled bomber, 6 miles above a city hidden by the smoke of another city that had died the night before, understood a truth that had been true throughout human history, but that had never before applied to a weapon like this. Sometimes the wind saves you. Sometimes the wind kills you. Long Island in 1776, a dense fog rolled over the East River at the perfect moment to hide George Washington's Continental Army from the British Royal Navy. The American revolutions survived that morning because of weather. At Kokura on the 9th of August 1945, the wind blew from the wrong direction at the wrong hour of the morning. And a city of 130,000 people was saved by smoke. The Japanese have a phrase for this, Kokura's luck. Kokura no corn. But somewhere else, someone else's luck was about to run out. Sweeney and Ashworth held a rapid conference on the intercom. Options were vanishing by the second. They did not have enough fuel to return to Tinian. They barely had enough fuel to reach the emergency airstrip on Okinawa. If they stayed over Kokura, they would either be shot down by interceptors or run out of fuel and crash into the sea with a live atomic weapon in the bomb bay. They would divert to the secondary target. They would divert to Nagasaki. Bockscar banked southwest. Great artistry followed. The 2 B-29s left Kokura behind and sprinted southwest across Kyushu toward the western coast. Nagasaki came into view at 10:50 in the morning. Nagasaki was covered in cloud, 70 to 80% cloud cover. The visual aiming point in the Urakami Valley was completely obscured. The city sat beneath a shifting blanket of white and grey, its harbour barely visible through occasional breaks in the deck. Sweeney checked his fuel gauges again. The needles were touching the red arc. There was not enough fuel for multiple bomb runs. There was barely enough fuel for a single pass over the target. If they did not drop the bomb on this pass, they would have to make a terrible choice. Nature's a live nuclear weapon into the East China Sea. Attempt to land at Okinawa with an armed atomic bomb still in the bomb bay. Ashworth stared through the small window at the cloud deck below. Then, Commander Frederick Ashworth, weaponeer of the second atomic bomb mission, made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He broke from the mission's binding operational order. Prepare for a radar approach. The words went out over the intercom. Radar operator acknowledged. Beahan glanced at Ashworth. Ashworth met his eye and nodded. Standing orders required that atomic bombs be dropped only by visual means, only through the Norden bombsight, only when a human bombardier could see the target with his own eyes and confirm the aiming point. Other bombing was strictly forbidden. But orders written weeks earlier meant nothing at the moment when the fuel ran out. Ashworth was in a crippled B-20 6 miles above a covered city, with the fuel needles bleeding into the red and no way to bring the weapon home. Bomb bay doors snapped open. Fat Man was exposed to the freezing thin air of 31,000 feet. The radar operator began to call out the final approach coordinates. Range, bearing, time to release, it would be a blind drop. Bomb would fall through cloud and land wherever the radar told it to fall. Recruit braced, and then at 11:01 am in the morning the impossible happened. Kermit Beahan, staring intently through the eyepiece of the Norden bombsight, saw a break in the clouds. Just a small break, a momentary gap where the cloud deck parted. Through that gap, Beahan saw the ground. He saw the unmistakable geometry of a stadium and a running track. He recognized it from the target folders. The stadium was in the Urakami Valley, roughly 1.5 miles north of the original aiming point. Close enough. Beahan's hands moved before his mind caught up. He shouted into the intercom. "I've got it." He took control of the drop sequence. Modern bombsight locked onto the stadium. The crosshairs aligned. Bombsight's analog computer took over the autopilot, making tiny corrections to airspeed and heading, calculating the precise ballistic trajectory of a 10,000-pound weapon falling from 31,000 feet at a ground speed of 200 knots. 11:02 in the morning, 9th of August, 1945, the restraining hooks released. Fat Man dropped from the belly of Bockscar. The sudden loss of 5 tons of weight caused the B-29 to leap violently upward, gaining hundreds of feet of altitude in seconds. Sweeney immediately threw the aircraft into a hard 60-degree diving turn. It was a maneuver they had practiced dozens of times. 90 put maximum distance between the fragile aluminum skin of the bomber and the ground zero of the coming explosion. The bomb was in freefall. The crew had exactly 43 seconds to escape. 43 seconds is a long time when you are counting. Marvel. While Fat Man tumbled through the sky, the intricate mechanisms inside its casing began to wake up. Parametric sensors measured the atmospheric pressure. LiDAR altimeters projected radio waves toward the approaching ground and calculated the descending altitude. The bomb was designed to detonate not on impact but in mid-air at an altitude of 1,650 feet. Specific altitude had been chosen for a specific reason. Airburst would produce a phenomenon called the Mach stem. The initial blast wave would travel downward, strike the ground and reflect upward. The reflected wave would merge with the still expanding primary shock wave, creating a combined wall of highly compressed air that would sweep outward parallel to the ground at hundreds of miles per hour. Supersonic bulldozer erasing everything in its path. Nail the falling bomb, the city of Nagasaki continued its mourning. Nagasaki Medical College Hospital, 700 meters from what would become Ground Zero, a 37-year-old physician named Takashi Nagai was examining X-ray plates. He was the head of the radiology department. He was a Catholic, father of 2 children. He had converted to Catholicism as a young medical student, drawn to the faith by the writings of Blaise Pascal and by the quiet courage of the Christians in Nagasaki who had kept their faith through 4 centuries of persecution. His wife, Midori, was 37 years old. She was at home, 800 meters from Ground Zero, preparing lunch for their family. At the Urakami Cathedral, the largest Catholic cathedral in East Asia, the confessional booths were occupied. Mass, the Feast of the Assumption of Mary, was approaching on the 15th of August. Parishioners were coming to confession in preparation. 2 Japanese priests, Father Nishida and Father Tamaya, were hearing confessions in the twin bell tower nave. Approximately 30 parishioners were inside the cathedral. At the Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works, roughly 6,200 factory workers were on shift. The plant produced torpedoes and naval ordnance. It was the industrial engine of Japan's war effort in the West. At Shiroyama Elementary School, 500 meters from ground zero, 1,400 students and 32 teachers were beginning their morning lessons. At the Fukuoka prisoner of war camp number 14, 152 Allied prisoners were performing forced labor at the Mitsubishi plant. American Marines captured on Wake Island, British soldiers taken at Singapore, Dutch colonial troops from the East Indies, Australian survivors of Rabaul. Air raid sirens had sounded earlier that morning at 8:30. But when only a small formation of American aircraft had appeared, the Japanese Air Defense Command had assumed it was a weather reconnaissance flight. All clear had been given. Civilians had emerged from their shelters. Workers had returned to their factories. Children had returned to their classrooms. At 11:02 in the morning, 43 seconds after Fat Man left the bomb bay of Bockscar, the radar altimeters agreed. Minimum height had been reached. The electrical firing circuits closed. In a fraction of a millisecond, the 32 explosive lenses surrounding the plutonium core detonated with perfect symmetry. The conventional blast wave traveled inward at supersonic velocity. The softball-sized sphere of delta-phase plutonium was crushed to twice its normal density. The polonium-beryllium initiator at the center of the core was compressed, releasing a flood of neutrons. The chain reaction began. In less time than it takes a human neuron to fire, a significant portion of the 13.6 pounds of plutonium underwent fission. Energy release was incomprehensible. 21 kilotons of TNT equivalent, roughly 40% more powerful than the bomb that had erased Hiroshima 3 days before. Night temperature at the epicenter exceeded 10 million degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the surface of the sun. The flash of light was so intense that people miles away were momentarily blinded. Thermal pulse ignited everything combustible within a 2-mile radius. Odd cloth, skin, bone. Below the detonation point, the Urakami Valley was subjected to instantaneous annihilation. But the geography of Nagasaki dictated a profoundly different outcome than the geography of Hiroshima. Hiroshima had been built on a flat river delta. The blast wave of Little Boy had expanded uniformly in all directions, leveling the entire city like a hand sweeping crumbs from a table. Nagasaki was a city of hills and deep valleys. The bomb had detonated directly over the Urakami Valley, flanked by steep ridges. The hills did not protect the valley, they amplified the destruction within it. The blast wave slammed into the ridges and reflected inward, intensifying the overpressure in the confined space. Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works, the very factory the mission had been sent to destroy, was directly beneath the epicenter. Steel frames melted. Its concrete was pulverized. Its heavy machinery was tossed through the air like broken toys. But those same hills shielded the rest of the city. Waves sheared the tops off the ridges, but left the harbor and the historic districts on the other side of the mountains relatively intact. This geographical accident limited the immediate death toll to an estimated 35,000 to 40,000 people. Horrific number. But less than half of the casualties inflicted on the flat plains of Hiroshima, despite the Nagasaki bomb carrying significantly greater yield. Urakami Cathedral, the 400-year-old heart of Japanese Catholicism, collapsed on the parishioners inside. Both priests were killed. An estimated 8,500 of the 12,000 Catholics of the Urakami district died on the 9th of August. A community that had survived shogunate persecution, that had hidden its faith through generations of secret martyrdom, emerged into the light only after Meiji. Art was destroyed by a weapon built by a Christian nation and dropped by a Christian crew. Shiroyama Elementary School was obliterated. Nearly every child inside died. At the Mitsubishi plant, 7 or 8 Allied prisoners of war were killed in the blast, killed by the very weapon their own countries had built to end their captivity. High above the carnage, Bockscar was fighting for its own survival. Sweeney threw the bomber into the diving evasive turn. First shockwave struck the aircraft moments after the flash, hammering the fuselage like a giant fist. second shockwave, reflected from the ground, slammed into them seconds later. A third, weaker wave followed. The B-29 rattled, its rivets groaned. Wings flexed, but it held together. Looking back through the windows, the crew saw the mushroom cloud rising at a speed no human eye could quite believe. Boiling, churning, radioactive, it punched through the stratosphere. At night it reached an altitude of 60,000 feet in minutes. Sweeney could not stare at the apocalypse. His fuel gauges were falling toward zero. The trapped 640 gallons in the bomb bay mocked him. A trip back to Tinian was mathematically impossible. South, toward Okinawa, toward Yontan airfield, toward the only strip of American-held runway he might possibly reach. Lost, he pulled back the throttles, he leaned the fuel mixture to the ragged edge of engine failure. He traded altitude for distance, letting the heavy bomber descend in a long, shallow glide. The four right engines coughed and stuttered as the crew fed them the last gallons of aviation fuel available in the usable tanks. An airfield came into view. Sweeney tried to raise the control tower on the radio. Radio was dead. Yontan was a busy field crowded with aircraft, with no idea that a B-29 carrying the crew that had just dropped the second atomic bomb was falling out of the sky toward its runway. Sweeney ordered every emergency flare on the aircraft fired at once. Red, green, and yellow flares streaked into the sky over Okinawa. Universal signal of catastrophic emergency. He did not have enough fuel to circle the airfield. He did not have enough fuel to make a proper approach. He had to drop the bomber onto the runway on the first attempt, in hot, coming in fast, coming in with his engines running on vapor. Bockscar crossed the threshold of the runway, the number 2 engine sputtered and died. Fuel. Moments later, the number 1 engine died as well. 29 slammed onto the tarmac. It bounced heavily. Sweeney stomped on the brakes. The hydraulic pressure was fading. Bomber hurtled down the runway, its brakes barely responding, heading straight for a line of parked B-24 Liberator bombers at the far end. Sweeney threw the 2 remaining engines into reverse pitch. Cyclones screamed in protest. The aircraft strained. The car shuddered to a halt, its nose pointed at the parked Liberators, just feet from disaster. The ground crews who ran out to meet the bomber found that the fuel tanks were completely bone dry. Landed on vapor. The mission was complete. On the other side of Kyushu, in a valley of twisted steel and boiling smoke, 40,000 people were already dead. 40,000 more would die by the end of the year. A doctor named Takashi Nagai was lying in the ruins of his hospital, his temporal artery cut open by flying glass, bleeding out on the floor of the building where he had spent his career trying to save lives. Takashi Nagai woke on the floor of what had been his hospital. He did not remember falling. He remembered light. Light brighter than anything the human eye was built to process. Then nothing. The taste of blood in his mouth. And then the sound of concrete groaning above him like a living thing about to die. A shard of window glass had opened his right temporal artery. Blood was leaving his body in rhythm with his own heartbeat. Takashi Nagai, a radiologist, who had spent his career studying the machinery of the human body, stood with perfect clinical detachment that he had perhaps 4 minutes to stop the bleeding before he lost consciousness for the last time. Pressed his own fingers to the wound, he held them there. Die. Around him, the Nagasaki Medical College Hospital was no longer a hospital. I was a skeleton of broken concrete and twisted rebar, 700 meters from a fire that had briefly burned hotter than the surface of the sun. Students who had been his responsibility, 9 young men and women training to become doctors and nurses, were crawling out from under desks and collapsed ceilings, coats stained red. He tied a strip of cloth around his own skull to slow the bleeding. And then he did the only thing a doctor knows how to do when the world has ended around him. He went to work. He organized the survivors. He sent the mobile among them to carry the wounded up the slope of Mount Mitsuyama away from the fires spreading through the valley below. He set broken bones with strips of window frame. He stopped hemorrhages with torn bedsheets. Did this for hours, working through a fog of blood loss and concussion, asked because the alternative was to stop. To stop was to let people die who did not have to. Norden. 3 days later, when the fires had finally burned themselves out, Nagai walked up the hill toward the small house where his wife Midori had been preparing lunch on the morning of the 9th of August. There was no house. There was a rectangle of ash where a house had been. Nagai searched through the debris with his hands. He found a set of house keys fused together by heat into a single molten lump of metal. And beside the keys he found the charred remains of a pelvic bone. Around what remained of that bone, half melted but still recognizable, the beads of a rosary. Midori Nagai had been 37 years old. She had been holding her rosary when the flash came. Nagai knelt in the ash of his own home and did not move for a long time. 800 kilometers to the northeast, in a concrete bunker beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, the same 6 men who had been deadlocked since Hiroshima filed once more into that airless room. I for peace, Anami Umezu and Toyoda for war. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War convened in emergency session on the afternoon of the 9th of August, hours after the second city had burned. The room was airless. The ventilation system strained against the August heat. The deadlock that had existed since Hiroshima had not moved an inch. Once more, 2 cities were gone. The Soviet Union had crossed the border into Manchuria in overwhelming force. There was no path forward that did not end in total annihilation. He agreed. Anami held his ground. He wanted his 4 conditions: preservation of the imperial system, no occupation of Japanese soil by foreign troops, voluntary disarmament conducted by the Japanese military itself, Japanese trials for Japanese war criminals conducted by Japanese courts. Anzu and Toyoda stood with him, 3 and 3, a perfect paralyzing deadlock exactly as it had been since the 6th of August. No mechanism in the Japanese constitutional order existed to break a tie among the Big Six. Or would simply continue by default, because 6 exhausted men in an airless room could not find 5 words of agreement. It was Prime Minister Suzuki who finally understood what had to happen. There was one voice in the empire whose word was, by ancient tradition, absolute. A voice that had never before been asked to settle a matter of state policy. A voice that had, for the entire history of modern Japan, remained silent above the machinery of government, sacred, symbolic, untouched by the grubby business of decision-making. Suzuki requested what was called a seiden, an imperial decision. Just after 11 at night on the 9th of August, 6, along with additional cabinet ministers, filed into a stifling underground bunker beneath the palace grounds. Hirohito, 44 years old, entered the room and took his seat. 3 hours the men argued in front of him. Same arguments, the same deadlock. Anami spoke of honor. Ogo spoke of survival. The clock ticked past midnight into the 10th of August. Finally, Suzuki turned to the emperor and asked him, for the first time in the history of the modern Japanese state, to render a decision himself. Manhito rose. His voice when it came was quiet, measured, almost gentle. He spoke of the destruction of the 2 cities, of the suffering of his people. He spoke of the impossibility of continuing a war that could no longer be won by any conceivable strategy. And then he said the words that ended the deadlock. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. Bear the unbearable. The room was silent. Spoken. Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration with the single condition that the imperial system be preserved. A diplomatic cable went out through neutral channels in Switzerland and Sweden. The message crossed the ocean to Washington, and for a moment it seemed as though the killing might finally stop. But the war was not yet over, because there was one more group of men in Tokyo who had not been in that room, heard the emperor's voice, and who had absolutely no intention of accepting what they viewed as an unforgivable act of national suicide. Night of the 14th of August, 5 days after Nagasaki, the recorded surrender broadcast had been made. Emperor Hirohito had gone to a small studio inside the palace grounds and read the imperial rescript into a microphone, his voice preserved on 2 phonograph records to be broadcast to the nation at noon the following day. Those records had to survive the night. A group of young army officers, led by a 33-year-old major named Kenji Hatanaka, believed that the surrender was a betrayal orchestrated by weak civilian ministers who had lost their nerve. They believed that if the recording could be destroyed before it was broadcast, the war could continue, still be rallied. The invasion could still be met and broken on the beaches, exactly as Ketsugo had planned. Tanaka needed the Imperial Guard on his side. He went to the commander of the 2nd Guards Regiment, Colonel Toyojiro Haga, and told him a lie. He told Haga that the Guards Division commander, Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori, had authorized the coup. Mori had not. When Hatanaka and his co-conspirators went to Mori's office to obtain his actual signature, the general refused. He would not participate in an act of open rebellion against the emperor's own decision. Tanaka drew his pistol and shot him. With Mori dead and his official seal stolen from his body, the conspirators forged the orders they needed. Using the fabricated authorization, they seized control of the imperial palace grounds. Throughout the night, armed soldiers searched every room, every filing cabinet, every desk drawer, hunting for 2 phonograph records that would end the war. They never found them. Our records had been hidden by a palace chamberlain in a small, unremarkable safe in an administrative office, buried beneath ordinary paperwork, exactly where no one would think to look for the most important recording in the history of the empire. By dawn on the 15th of August, the rebellion was collapsing. General Shizuichi Tanaka, commander of the Eastern District Army, arrived at the palace and confronted the mutineers directly. His authority and the simple fact that the coup had no legitimate foundation was enough. Soldiers who had been deceived into participating stood down. Kenji Hatanaka rode a motorcycle to the open lawn in front of the palace. He distributed leaflets explaining his actions to a public that was still asleep. And then, as the sun rose fully over Tokyo, he placed a pistol to his own head and fired. Our Minister Korechika Anami did not join the coup. But he had never been able to accept the surrender in his heart. In the early hours of the 15th of August, in his official residence, Army committed seppuku, ritual disembowelment, choosing to die by his own hand rather than live to see the flag lowered. A farewell note read, in part, that he offered his death in atonement for a great crime. At exactly 12 noon on the 15th of August 1945, radios across Japan and crackled to life with a broadcast the nation had never heard before. The voice of the Emperor, speaking directly to his people for the first time in the history of the modern date. The recording quality was poor. The language was formal court Japanese, archaic even to educated listeners, filled with phrases that many ordinary citizens struggled to fully parse. But the meaning, when it finally settled over the nation, was unmistakable. War had ended. Japan had lost. On the 2nd of September, the battleship USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, walking on a prosthetic leg, lost years earlier in an assassination attempt, signed the instrument of surrender on behalf of the Japanese government. General Yoshijiro Umezu signed on behalf of the imperial military. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the ceremony for the Allied powers. The Second World War was over. The men who had carried out the mission over Nagasaki went on to live long American lives. Charles Sweeney was promoted to Major General. He commanded units of the Massachusetts Air National Guard. He raised a family, gave interviews, adoringly, over the decades that followed. And when he finally wrote his memoir in 1997, at war's end, he defended, apology, every decision he had made on that long morning over Kyushu. I died in 2004 at the age of 84. Frederick Ashworth rose to the rank of Vice Admiral. He served for decades in the post-war Navy. He was never disciplined, never questioned in any formal way, for the order he had given to abandon a visual bomb run and trust instead in radar. I died in 2005 at the age of 93. Kermit Beahan left the military in 1964 with the rank of major. And his fellow airmen had given him a nickname that followed him for the rest of his life. Bombardier, who got a birthday present. He died in 1989 at the age of 71. Tibbets, who had commanded the 509th Composite Group and flown the Enola Gay over Hiroshima, died in 2007 at the age of 92. He left instructions that there should be no funeral service and no headstone. Want his grave to become a place of protest. Bockscar itself still exists. It sits today inside the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, its aluminum skin polished, its bomb bay doors closed, a silent artifact behind velvet rope. Takashi Nagai, the physician who had held his own bleeding scalp together with his fingers, and then buried the fused house keys and rosary of his wife in the ash of Nagasaki, lived 6 more years. Radiation exposure had already been steadily destroying his blood before the bomb fell, a legacy of decades spent working unshielded beside X-ray machines. Bombing accelerated what had already begun. He was diagnosed with leukemia and confined largely to a small hut he called the Nyokodo, where he continued to write. In 1949, he published a memoir titled The Bells of Nagasaki. It became one of the most widely read books in post-war Japan. Meditation on suffering, faith, and the impossible task of finding meaning inside a catastrophe that had taken nearly everyone he loved. That same year, the city of Nagasaki named him its first honorary citizen. In May of 1949, Emperor Hirohito personally visited his sickbed. Pius XII sent a letter of blessing from Rome. Takashi Nagai died on the 1st of May 1951, 43 years old. For 80 years, historians have argued over what actually ended the Second World War. The President Harry Truman and Secretary of War Henry Stimson always maintained that the atomic bombs saved lives. That without them, Operation Downfall would have proceeded as planned, and hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, along with millions of Japanese civilians and soldiers, would have died in an invasion of the home islands that made the beaches of Normandy look like a training exercise. But Japan had not surrendered after Hiroshima. The second bomb, they argued, was the necessary and final proof that the destruction could and would continue indefinitely. The voices, some of them present in the room at the time, told a more complicated story. Admiral William Leahy, Truman's own chief of staff, wrote after the war that in his opinion, the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been of no material assistance in the war against a Japan that was, in his judgment, already defeated. Decades later, the historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa examined the actual minutes of the Big Six meetings held in the hours after Nagasaki. What he found complicated the simple narrative that most Americans had grown up believing. Those meetings, the men in that airless Tokyo bunker spent far more time discussing the Soviet invasion of Manchuria than they spent discussing the second atomic bomb. Transcripts from the earliest hours after Nagasaki barely mentioned the city by name at all. Perhaps it was the bomb. Perhaps it was the Red Army crossing into Manchuria at 1 minute past midnight. Perhaps it was both, arriving within hours of each other, compounding into a psychological weight that finally broke 6 exhausted men who had been arguing in circles since the 6th of August. It rarely offers a single clean cause, it offers instead a convergence. Collision of forces that no single decision by any single man fully controls. Certain is this: Nagasaki was never supposed to be the target. It entered the target list only because an old man remembered his honeymoon in a city called Kyoto. Bockscar was never supposed to be flown by that crew. It happened only because scientific instruments could not be moved from one aircraft to another in time. Our bomb was never supposed to fall on the Urakami Valley. It happened because smoke from a burning steel mill drifted over Kokura in exactly the wrong direction, not because a fuel pump failed before takeoff. Because one aircraft climbed 9,000 feet too high and vanished from a rendezvous. Because a commander chose to trust radar over standing orders. And because a bombardier caught sight of a stadium through a gap in the clouds that lasted perhaps 20 seconds. seconds, multiplied against 80 years of consequence. A wristwatch somewhere in a glass case in Nagasaki still reads 11:02. Has never moved again, and the question it asks, silently, to every visitor who stops to look at it, is a question this country has never fully answered, perhaps never will. Mining. If any single one of those 9 decisions had gone differently that morning, Nagasaki still stand today exactly as it once was, its cathedral bells still ringing over the Urakami Valley, its 400 years of quiet faith unbroken. I know, that is the calculation history has never finished making.